Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's CEAS Network webinar. My name is Dakir Warren, and I'm the Director of Network Learning and Engagement with Demand Abolition. Demand Abolition works to eradicate the demand for the purchase of illegal commercial sex in the United States. And as such, we've catalyzed a network of 12 cities, known as CEAS, Cities Empowered Against Sexual Exploitation, located throughout the U.S., all of which are collectively working to reduce the demand for commercial sexual exploitation. During our monthly webinar series, we provide targeted training and information for stakeholders and practitioners working to reduce demand. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you that we've muted everyone on the phone lines, but also ask that attendees mute their individual phones as well. Within the next hour, you'll learn about some of the primary cultural and social forces that may influence men to buy sex. Based on a concept used in the sales and marketing industry, a buyer journey involves analyzing the steps, emotions, opportunities, tools, and information needed for someone to make the final decision to purchase. Our presenters will explore various progressions into sex buying behavior and share a series of social influences and exposure to prompts throughout life that may lead to someone buying sex. The sex buyer journey has been developed to help determine key opportunities for early intervention and deterrence, including tactics and strategies already developed, tested, and refined by members of the CEAS network. Our presenters, Bianca Morales-Egan, Technical Advisor for Human Trafficking and Gender Equity at Project Concern International, and co-chair of the San Diego County Advisory Council on Human Trafficking's Community Subcommittee and CEAS San Diego Coordinator, along with Angie Bayless, Director of CEAS Network Arizona and a leader in the Arizona movement to end sex trafficking, will share what they've learned throughout the mapping the buyer journey process and explain why it will take more than effective arrest and prosecution strategies to address the problem. Throughout the webinar, we will pause periodically to provide opportunities for attendees to pose direct questions to our presenters. In this case, we are actually going to ask that all questions be held to the end of the presentation. We will monitor on our end any chat box questions or hands raised and alert you in priority order at the end of the webinar to let you know that it's okay to ask your question. Please be sure, again, to click on the hand button of your control panel to notify us of your desire to ask a question, and again, at the appropriate point, you will be called upon. And now, I'm happy to introduce our presenters, Bianca and Angie. Take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dakir, and thanks everyone for joining us on this session. We're going to jump right into it so we have enough time to get through and also have some great questions at the end. But we really want to begin with what this buyer journey concept is and how it started and how and why we're connecting it to the sex buyer journey. A few members of the CEAS network, namely members from Portland and Atlanta, San Diego, and Phoenix, came together to participate in a Google design sprint, which is Google's own internal process they use for developing new products internally. And so Google also hosts design sprints for other social service agencies and nonprofits as part of their charitable efforts. So we had the good fortune of having two Google Sprint Masters come to San Diego from their headquarters in Mountain View, California in March of this year to host a 4-day sprint. And the challenge of that 4-day sprint is really to enhance existing tools to continue to reduce the demand for illegal commercial sex. We realized that through the CEAS network over the past 3 to 4 years, many CEAS partners had already invested a lot of time and effort into new technologies that could disrupt the commercial sex marketplace. And we didn't want to reinvent any of those wheels or produce something that's already been produced. So our challenge really was to look at what we had, take an inventory, and really enhance and build upon those existing tools during this Google Sprint. So besides the 2 great prototypes that we came out at the end of those 4 days, which are the Buyer Typology Project and Resource Map or Playbook for CEAS Tactics, one of the really great takeaways was the concept of this buyer journey and how could we map the process from a non-buyer to a buyer of sex. So the mapping a buyer journey, really part of what we're talking about here is the commercial part of commercial sexual exploitation or illegal commercial sex. It is commercial. And the legitimate commercial industry has put a lot of time and money and energy into analyzing what this buyer journey concept is. Marketing firms and departments of major industry leaders like Google and Salesforce are recognizing this as a main framework for increasing sales of their products and services. It's especially designed for online and social media marketing, which, as we know, is where the majority of commercial sex is taking place and is being advertised is online. So some research, a lot of research has gone into doing, this mapping of the buyer journey, and one quote by the Serious Decision says that 67% of the buyer's decision is complete before a buyer even reaches out to sales. So they've already gone through this process of decision making and choosing options and searching and so forth, even before they reach out to actually make that purchase. So this is, the modern way people are purchasing, right? We all look on Google, search our products for a while before we actually push that purchase button. And so we're doing our online searches and finding the information we need before we actually, again, choose to purchase. So they have these customers, and if relating to sex buyers, will make up their minds before they even actually reach out to buy the product, which is what we've spent a lot of our time and energy really is focusing on that time of transaction versus before or after. So what are those steps in a buyer journey? This is a great, Salesforce did this great series of GIFs to show the steps from simple awareness, like knowing what the product or service exists, all the way to evangelizing or having your customers actually promote your products to other customers. So many of the concepts we've discussed in the past around CEASE, related to demand and the sex buyer, are similar to this, right? For instance, we've talked about when and how boys become aware of commercial sex through online pornography, escort ads, entertainment media, music lyrics, and everything else, and how they justify the purchase afterwards. We've also talked about how they will actually do the purchase. Is it on Backpage, Craigslist, Daddy's List, etc., and how they can actually become promoters of commercial sex. As we know, there's review boards. We know of the big sting that was done in Washington State where buyers were actually charged as promoters. So many of these concepts we've already looked at and look familiar to us in the conversations we've had around sex buying and amongst the CEASE network and its partners. But really, when we're looking at the sex buyer journey, how do we put all these pieces together? And what is the bigger picture? This, the buyer framework, the buyer journey framework is all about inbound marketing, or it's attraction marketing, right? So instead of interrupting your potential customer during the course of their day, like a TV commercial in the middle of the day where it's advertising something that you're not thinking about or don't need, inbound marketing, this approach really meets them where they are. And it provides helpful, valuable content for them as they search for what they need or when they have a moment of discovery, quote. This moment for a sex buyer may not be when they're driving down the road and see a billboard denouncing human trafficking. It's very easy for buyers to disconnect from that type of messaging. But their moment of discovery may be when they see a pop-up ad on their Facebook feed between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m., which we know in San Diego is a peak time when buyers are looking on Backpage to set up dates. So providing some valuable answers at every stage, we're able to nurture customers, and that's the traditional marketing way, is really nurturing your customers into a relationship, if you will. We probably want to dissuade, right, in our approach, customers to making that decision or putting them on the path of a right decision. So we want to avoid the more traditional approaches of marketing, like waiting or sales until they hear a message, or waiting until they get arrested, or shaming them afterwards. But we really want to give buyers the right message at the right time and according to the particular stage they're at, the state of mind they're at, and then move them in a right direction. So when is that moment of discovery for a sex buyer, and how can we reach them in those opportune moments?
Thanks, Bianca. I'm going to jump in here.
Yeah.
So we had this sort of light bulb go off while we were sitting at this Google design sprint when they talked about mapping a journey. We thought, what if we apply this to sex buying and we flip it on its head and re-engineer the concept backwards? So if we know that people are buying sex, how can we deconstruct those steps and go back? Perhaps when a boy is younger and he's learning about relationships and gender and some of these issues, or all these different steps along the way that a boy becomes a man, or during the life cycle of a person's life, what can we do to dissuade buying behavior through these same online marketing and inbound marketing tools, And then we looked at it and we thought, wait, we're already doing this in a lot of our tactics, especially the ones that we think are pretty effective. So we thought, okay, if we're already doing this and it's working, how can we be even better? How can we be even smarter about it? How can we focus all of our energy and our efforts onto those tactics that we know are going to have the greatest impact? Next slide.
Thanks, Angie. Yeah, so what we did, as Angie said, prompted here, is we sat in a room for 4 days with, experts who've done a lot of research and thought about, sex buying and demand for illegal commercial sex, and mapped this out. So you can see it was a very contributory, a lot of people putting up ideas, brainstorming type session. And really, we thought, what are those steps to buying sex? So you could see sort of some of the initial steps, emotions, opportunities, tools, maybe some of the data needs that we needed to inform ourselves on what if we wanted to learn more about the exposure stage, what kind of data information would we need to learn more about that. And this is what we came up with. Very obviously drafty first draft paper prototype, which is part of, like I said, what Google does internally for their own product development process. So you can see the different steps that we came up with: exposure, social discovery, searching, actual contacting, meeting, exchanging, the encounter, reconciling the process, social rediscovery, reinforcement, promotion, and you could see that we really, in our first draft here, is somewhat time-bound. We were looking at, what is it from youth to adulthood, and we were also looking at it in a linear fashion, from maybe a start, to an end, or a progression per se. And then we met again.
And so the first mapping exercise, there was a room full of people sitting around a table. Again, we said over 4 days. Our Google Sprint masters they were watching the clock and literally keeping us to task. And we had a limited amount of time to look at this. And it was very interesting because we had people who were experts at this issue and people who were absolutely had no idea about this issue, all working together to map the journey. So we took what we had learned from that first exercise, and we met again in Boston, the entire CEAS network, all the coordinators. So you had a room full of experts. This was back in the early summer. And we did the same exact exercise that we did with Google. And we didn't even want to give anybody any idea of what we had come up with at Google. We just wanted to see what flowed. So the journey this time around was very similar, but it also had a little bit deeper layers of systematic cultural and social factors that influence sex buying, such as toxic masculinity, male privilege, early sexualization, male peer groups, a lot of more complex things that are built into this. And it was, a very worthwhile exercise. We all felt pretty energized by the activity. And at the end of that time, I was tasked as putting it all together, getting this journey, getting all the thoughts and ideas that came out of the Google Sprint, all the thoughts and ideas that came from the Boston convening, putting it into bringing it to life in some sort of depiction or drawing, and then sending it out amongst all the coordinators to give their feedback and their input so that it was truly the product of us all. So we all had come up with this together. And as along that journey of creating this thing, certain things popped up, things that we know we've already been doing. What are risk? Where does risk fit into this? Where does shame fit into it? What are triggers that might happen along the journey? So you can go ahead and go on to the next slide.
Okay. So we were, as Angie said, really looking at the whole process, but we also realized that, it's not a silver bullet, and it's not, to be overgeneralized that every sex buyer goes through the same exact journey. We, very much recognize that the sex buyer journey is not a definitive statement about the scope and sequence of male socialization that leads, to sex buying. We recognize that most men do not buy sex, and that do not go down this journey. So we're very conscious of the fact that we weren't going to overprescribe this journey, nor was it a justification for sex buying behavior. We weren't saying, well, we still want to hold sex buyers accountable for the behavior and the actions, but just get a little deeper understanding of maybe where it's coming from. But we do feel that the sex buyer journey is a framework for understanding some of the primary cultural forces that influence men to becoming sex buyers. Instead of really focusing on, the individual per se, let's look at the systems around it, and how those, push maybe somebody into this type of behavior. And what we've heard from experts like Peter Qualiotin in Seattle, that has stated in a past webinar that we really need to look beyond the individual sex buyer's behavior and take a look at the cultural forces and public attitudes that really support prostitution and sex buying behavior. So this journey has allowed us to, broaden that framework and look at those cultural influences, and that it's progression. It's not maybe an overnight, decision. It's really those social influences and exposures to different prompts throughout life that can lead someone to buying sex, and those moments of discovery, like we were talking about earlier, along the way that can be identified and addressed if we're really smart about it. So what we came up with, Angie?
So putting it all together, yes, this was quite a task trying to make it come to life. And so if you could see there a little bit behind the puzzle piece there, the first version of this thing when we started really putting it pencil to paper was linear, just like it was with the Google Sprint, where we actually saw a boy, the young boy, walking down this path, making certain turns in his path, being exposed to his peer groups, making right turns and left turns, and then eventually ending up as a promoter. And we worked on this a lot. We built out each stage, and we went back and forth amongst the network partners about how you would describe each stage and if we were on the right path here. And then we came back together again just a month ago in San Diego, all the original group that was at the Google Sprint. And we said, you know what, I think we want to go back to an earlier version where it is not linear, but it's more circular. Because we know that certain steps like exposure, there could be a buyer who had gone through some of these steps, started buying, stopped buying, and then somehow was triggered again and got back into this cycle. And we know that not all buyers are going to progress all the way up to promoters. They may do this one time and then be done and change their behavior, or they may go all the way back. So we really felt that the circular depiction made a lot more sense, and we're pretty excited to see how other groups are mapping out journeys of survivors similarly, and they use a circle as well, and we didn't even realize that. So the survivor journey and the buyer journey, although quite opposite in its actual reality, is somewhat similar in that there are stages and there are events in life, and there are reasons why someone does a certain thing or something happens to somebody. So our big task was putting all of that together. This is what it looked like. The latest version looks like this here on the left, and we're going to go through the next slides and walk you through each of those stages. We're also going to walk you through various tactics that we know have already been used and proved to be working in the CEAS network. Many of you on the call today are not currently active CEAS network partners, but maybe you're allies or you want to get started in anti-demand work. So we can share with you various tactics that we know are working, and we have been working very diligently on the playbook, which was the other goal coming out of that Google Sprint, of literally step-by-step guides that can walk you through how to do each of these things successfully. And we really think this buyer journey is step one. So you truly understand your customer or the buyer, and then you can go ahead and you can target message him and do certain interventions along the way to stop the behavior. Next slide.
Great. So we'll start with the first step in the process which we identified as learn. We know that cultural norms shape our behaviors and what we consider acceptable behavior. And this stage is really addressing those mostly early years, but they could be later in life as well, when especially males are exposed to toxic masculinity, or in other words, how a patriarchal society is harmful to men by denying unmasculine traits and rewarding behaviors like anger, violence, and destructive habits. This toxic idea of what it is to be a man, which many are exposed to, is reinforced also by negative role models, and it's both harmful to men and normalizes the objectification of women in many cases. And this is, sort of the everyday stuff we're seeing, and the clues and the social clues and the role modeling in our homes and schools and sports teams and other social contexts, those locker room talks and so forth. And so, when we were doing the sprint as well, we identified some of the emotions around that. There could be frustration, there could be an acceptance, there could be a lack of acceptance, there could be confusion, they could feel proud, they could feel rejection. And we did learn, or this reinforced this process too, that we're dynamic beings, right? We don't feel the same thing. We're not static in our emotions. And of course, this is the same with each stage along the journey, is that your emotions are complex and they change and they're variable. But trying to identify some of those emotions and maybe maybe one that stands out is a way we can address it at that stage. But some of the opportunities and tactics at this stage would be, really the parents and caregivers and educators that have uniquely positioned to mitigate the impact of this toxic masculinity, and have the opportunity to fortify a boy's sense of agency by building his self-esteem, building resilience, empowering him to become an agent of change, to become that leader, through activities and different curricula and stuff that really reinforce compassion, forgiveness, self-love, mindfulness. So it's really an extension of social emotional learning that we hear about. It doesn't always happen in appropriate ways, as we know, unfortunately, for our youth. And there's programs out there like Coaching Men into Boys, or PAVE, or I Empathize. There's a great curriculum out of Chicago, the CASE curriculum for the prevention of sexual exploitation for boys, Raise Boys, and others. And here in San Diego, we're building a curriculum, or have built a curriculum for boys in those younger ages, so those 8 to 12-year-old ranges, where we can really look at some of those factors and how do we balance those so they're not as toxic. And some of the things we might want to learn at this stage too are how does prevention work, and how can we really measure prevention? So that's stage 1. Stage 2 we identify as exposure. And we recognize that, also males are exposed to harmful role modeling and often incorrect messages on the internet, entertainment media, pornography from their peers. And pornography in particular can reinforce not only victimization of those who are in the pornography, the movies, the print, but also portraying an unrealistic and unhealthy and often violent presentation of sexual behavior that's really harmful, especially to young people who are just maybe learning about sex for the first time. So we know that the average age of first viewing pornography is now 11.5 years old for boys. And research and documentaries have shown that porn is different, right? And there's a culture that's being absorbed into pop culture that is making it more hardcore, violent, sexist, and racist. And recent seminars by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation have really conducted research on this and the connections between pornography and sexual violence, trafficking, relationship damage, sibling sexual violence, positive attitude towards sex with younger adolescents, violence against women, just to name a few. So, again, what are some of those ways that we can reverse that? Some of the emotions, curiosity, embarrassment, sexual neediness, powerful, just, and a mixed bag of emotions as per most stages. And what are those sort of purchase, we call, if you go back to the marketing terms of a journey, purchase propensity disruption tactics, to put it into, those terms. But how do we really dissuade them from eventually buying, or how do we counteract those or those violent messages, through those types of media, and we could also do social media campaigns, sex health education, the male pledge campaigns, which several of the C cities have done to really, show a camaraderie of males who are standing up to the issue and showing that, not most men, as I said, don't buy sex, and how can we really reinforce that messaging through a male perspective. So those are the first two stages that we looked at, and stage number 3.
Great. Yeah, moving on. So we know after a boy has learned about some of this stuff and been exposed to it online or via social media or YouTube or his friends or God knows what, there is that place or that moment in time where this potential buyer decides, asks himself a question. Do I need this? Do I want this? Is this justified for me? Should I do this? And it starts to become an actual choice, and that choice starts with a search. And we know that this happens for any buyer who's buying any product nowadays. They're going to do a little research. And so at this point in time, the buyer is doing his research. He's doing his homework. He's searching, are there police, what are the consequences if I do this? What could possibly happen to me? Or where do I go to buy sex? Or what would it be like? Or what do people say it's like? And so at this point in time, when that buyer starts entering certain search terms into Google or Bing, we have tactics already that are quite effective where we feed up ads, search ads against those search terms. So someone might type in, prostitute near me, or where do I find an escort, or how do I get a happy ending? And they might get an ad that is actually a Google ad that comes from our efforts that say, buy sex, lose everything, or don't do it, or some sort of messaging there that could just in that exact moment potentially put a seed of doubt in that buyer's mind and think maybe this is a bad choice and that it's not justified and this is something I should not be doing. So at this stage, the buyer is assessing his risks and rewards, and that's a very important stage. That's where a lot of our tactics are currently focused on. That's where social media campaigns come up, where Google AdWords, where we think a really important new policy or a new tactic that's very important is at this search stage, where there's actually company policies for employees against searching on Backpage at work or looking at porn or doing some of these things that might lead a buyer into that next stage. So we'll go ahead and move on to that next stage. So the buyer has learned, he's been exposed, he's done his homework, he's decided, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I am ready to connect with a provider, I'm ready to buy sex, I know, when I'm going to do it. And how is he feeling at this time? He may be nervous, he may be afraid, he may be excited, he may feel a sense of power or turned on, or all sorts, again, that mixed bag of emotions that would take a person from searching and thinking about it to actually, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make a decision, I'm going to make a plan. So we know that a lot of buyers, there's three main types of prostitution. We have street prostitution, where the buyer would drive up and down a street track and locate a provider on the side of the road and make a deal from the car window. Then we know we have illicit massage prostitution, where a buyer would actually have to drive in his vehicle or take transportation to a location that's actually a commercial front brothel, which is, disguised thinly as a health spa, where the buyer would go into that location knowing very well, because he'd already done his research, that this is a house of prostitution and that he is very likely to be able to make a transaction at that location. So what are the tactics that we know work at this stage, the connect stage? Well, clearly, this is where the arrest operations happen. When a buyer makes a deal for prostitution and actually offers to change hands money with an undercover police officer, that is a moment, an arrestable offense for solicitation. We also know that cyber patrols are really effective here. So when the buyer is calling a prostituted person on the phone or texting via a text message, what if the person on the other end of the phone wasn't actually a real prostituted person, but was either a civilian doing a cyber patrol, potentially a male allies group doing the bunch of guys approach that we're all familiar with? Or what if that person on the other line was a female detective impersonating a prostituted person and then could talk to the buyer and then flip the script on him and actually talk about the harms of prostitution and reasons why he shouldn't go on along this path, and say, you know, today's your lucky day, you're not going to get arrested today. But if you had made this same transaction with a real prostituted person, and it was witnessed by a detective on the street or a law enforcement officer, or if you had made a deal with an undercover officer in person or when they were doing an operation, you would indeed be arrested, and these are the consequences that you would face. So right there at that moment, you have this mixed bag of emotions. You have a buyer who's terrified potentially. You have a real opportunity to dissuade and to change somebody's mind. So that's where we're at with the connect phase, and I will go on to the next phase.
So following that and doing that kind of reaching out and actually making the connection, there's the actual transaction or the actual purchase. And this is where you're going, you know, the buyer would actually go through with a transaction. You're at the point and location of purchasing another human being. And this is really where criminality or crime enforcement, you know, can also, as Angie said, take place. You know, the location of it is also really important. And the type of service, if you will, quote unquote, that's happening is also important to look at. Is it, as Angie said, an illicit massage establishment? Is it a hotel? Is it a street? Is it a brothel? Is it in a parking lot? Is it in a place of business? You know, what is that location? Where is that purchase happening? Again, I mean, there's going to be a range of emotions here: hesitant, powerful, adrenaline rush, nervous, terrified, and you know, different things going through at this point that we really, again, you know, need to be conscious and aware of, especially if we're trying to dissuade at that moment to make a totally different path. Some of the opportunities and tactics at this stage would be your, as Angie already described, your typical arrest operations by law enforcement, where police, you know, set up stings and focus on arresting the buyers. Or maybe there's a recognition of the buyer at the location known for commercial sex, and it could be reported, like the Report John policing app that's been piloted in Oakland, where people can report the license plate of cars in known locations for prostitution, commercial sexual exploitation, and sex trafficking, or found engaging in illicit sexual activity, and the police department will then send a letter based on that, you know, evidence to the registered owner of that vehicle, and stating that their vehicle was spotted in an area known of high incidence of sexual exploitation and trafficking. So, you know, that's one tactic of just really at that point noticing where that location is, where that transaction is happening, that we could you know, deter the path. But also business engagement, like Angie mentioned. What would be important here, you know, is to warn those places. If it's a place of, you know, training all employees, again, with company policies about what to see, you know, warning them, training them, educating them on potential sites, and, you know, that in businesses that's where sexual exploitation can occur. So it could be the hotels as well. There's been a big outreach effort in many cities to do hotel motel training to identify those red flags and to report them. But there's also the next stage, which is evaluate. So this is after, let's suppose you don't get caught. Suppose the buyer doesn't get caught. You know, now what happens? And do they buy again? You know, we know in the sales and marketing world that this is really that relationship, right? You're trying, the seller is trying to, in the commercial industries, legitimate commercial industries, this, you know, they're really trying to nurture that relationship with the buyer. But in this instance, we're really trying, again, to dissuade at this point. And some of the emotions at this point, the buyer may be feeling, you know, regret, they may be feeling proud, and they may be feeling satisfied, unsatisfied, they may have a sense of power. And we've heard from research that most sex buyers often feel guilt, often feel negative feelings about their experience. Some don't feel emotional connection at all through it, which is probably highly likely, but often likes the power and the freedom from not having a relationship. So at the end of the day, you know, we need to again look at what are those social attitudes that are supporting their decision. And unless the buyer is arrested or understands, how it's a form of exploitation and gender-based violence, they're not going to be dissuaded from continuing the activity. So again, it reinforces that we need to look at those social, cultural contexts and influences that really are saying, it was fine what you did. You didn't get arrested. You didn't get caught. So you could make that decision again, basically. So some of our opportunities here, how can we really reach those buyers, and in particular those who are buying again and make that decision to buy again, and at that point, so again, the Google AdWords campaigns where they're going to search. If we have the list of high-frequency buyers that we've collected through things like cyber patrols or or through actual arrests, or through things like College Girls for Hire, or we know that they're high frequency buyers, then how do we make sure we're pinging them with these messages, and looking at text campaigns as well. We can go through social media messaging. Maybe it's the stage of really having deep mental health counseling, or as in Seattle, the sex buyer education class, which really goes from, this is a form of gender-based violence. How can we really look at this, toxic masculinity, and really reinforce positive masculinity? So again, that's after the transaction. What happens then, and what are some of the messaging that we can really tailor at that point so that they make the decision not to buy again?
Okay, so moving on in the journey, so he's gone through the purchase and then he's thought about it and he's made an internal decision. You know what? This was good for me, or a good experience. I enjoyed it. I'm going to do this again, but actually I'm going to be a spider consumer. I'm going to go on these forums or USA Sex Guide or Erotic Review, and I'm going to find some providers, and I'm going to be part of this actual community that rates the women, the prostituted people, gives reviews and contributes to the review process, much like Yelp would, or TripAdvisor, or some other service that a person that would not buy sex would be likely to contribute with. This is peer review. This is what they call in Salesforce the evangelizing stage, where peer-to-peer marketing, where word-of-mouth marketing, where one buyer is going to go online and talk to another buyer, obviously most of the time behind a secrecy or a handle or some sort of ID that nobody knows who they really are. So they have this hidden persona or another personality that they can hide behind, where they feel emboldened and they feel confident, and they have that sense of peer validation that is very important to keep somebody continuing to do this that's going to become a high-frequency buyer. We know that not all high-frequency buyers are part of these review communities, but some of them are. And we know that from research done by Demand Abolition that an estimated 5% of buyers drive over 50% of the market. So that means a very small number of buyers are out there buying so often and really causing the prostitution problem in our cities, because there is a demand directly related to that small group of consumers that are known buyers. They're going to buy, they want new blood, or they want new fresh meat. So it could be new providers brought into commercial front brothels or massage parlors, providers from certain countries, like the K-Girls Delight system that they took down in Seattle. Those were buyers that were looking for a very specific type of provider, and they went on these forums to discuss where they might find these providers. So we really struggled both at Google when we were doing the Google meeting and in Boston with the coordinators. What can we do here at this stage? What is being done? And not that much is being done now, because these forums are pretty hard to infiltrate if you're not a buyer. There's various mechanisms to, the more you review and the more active you are on these forums, the higher up your credibility goes and your access. So unless you're a legitimate reviewer, it's going to be pretty hard for you, unless you're a very dedicated undercover detective, which I'm sure there are. It's going to be very hard for you to get infiltrate into these very closed communities of buyers. So how on earth can we, as people who care about this issue that want to do something, how can we get involved at this stage? And again, we really think you can do the text message campaigns to the known high-frequency buyer list. here in Arizona, we have a top 100 list. Those guys have called 5 or more ads in 3 months. So they may or may not be in these closed review circles, but we do know that they're buying a lot. So that is a way to reach them. Obviously, there are some buyers that will have gotten arrested that are currently in this cycle and in this rate and review place in their buying journey. What kind of messaging at the court-ordered sex buyer education programs can be targeted to those types of guys? They're a lot harder to change their minds, but there is that moment, that place where somebody who's well-trained and somebody like Peter Qualiatine in Seattle, who's been doing this and understands the psyche of the buyer, can truly impact him at that place and time. So again, this is a very critical stage that we know is important. We don't have all the answers yet, and we're really going to spend some energy in exploring this stage. However, we know that the small amount of buyers out there, so that's 5% of all buyers are in this place. We know from the marketing language that we learned from Salesforce that it is much more costly to attract a new customer than it is to retain an existing one. So what if we, in our work, flip this upside down and we spent more of our efforts making sure that boys and young men and men, all men, never become buyers in the first place, or if they've bought once or twice, that they stop the buying behavior and that they never ever progress to this stage, this rate and review stage, which we know is pretty far along in the journey. So what if we spent more of our energy and more of our efforts on that prevention and that intervention stage, and knowing that it's going to be significantly harder to get these guys at the rate and review stage. The final stage that we have, next slide, is the promotion stage. And we know here that these are the guys that have been on the review sites for long enough that they truly believe that they are 100% bought into prostitution. They may even become salesmen or evangelizers for the issue. We have a provider or a buyer here in Phoenix that goes by the handle Dave in Phoenix. And everyone knows in the law enforcement community who Dave in Phoenix is. He shows up at every court hearing. He sits in the back, he takes notes, and then he goes and he gets on USA Sex Guide and he shares all the information from all the court proceedings. He even talks about arrest operations. He talks about the billboard campaigns we've done here in Arizona. He talks about everything we're doing because he feels like he is an expert. And he is actually out there promoting the industry in itself. There are even some buyers who think that this is a business opportunity. You know, why don't I start a brothel? Or like we saw with the big takedown in Seattle, those guys actually felt like they were part of an operation there. And the Seattle team was able to effectively take down this ring and go after these guys that were promoting prostitution with felony promotion arrests. And I believe, you know, there's been all sorts of outcomes of that, one from a guy who committed suicide to another, you know, to various levels of imprisonment and fines and et cetera. All those guys are having to go through the very, very detailed sex buyer education program that's 10 weeks in Seattle. So we know that this is a complicated place and that these guys are emboldened, that the emotions these guys are feeling is proud, confident. They feel like they're above the law. They've avoided serious consequences. They actually self-define as hobbyists or mongers. So these guys think that you know, they know everything about this and that they are above or better than getting caught. So for those of us working in the anti-demand space, of course, we want to try to do whatever we can to take down those networks of buyers, to close down the review sites, to such as RevMaps or USA Sex Code, or My Red Book was taken down, or the site in Seattle that was taken down. Those are really great steps. They're much harder to do, but we, you know, challenge all law enforcement that's out there to put your efforts into breaking into these small closed networks and going after those promoters. We do know through this process that not all buyers that start at Learn are going to progress all the way through up to Promote. There's oftentimes places or buyers will get off of this cycle, and that's really our challenge, and that is our That is our call here. How do we activate partners who are working in this industry in all the various sectors, not just in, you want to go to the next slide, Bianca, not just in the anti-trafficking space, but in media or educators or business community or government leaders, faith communities, the tech industry, other nonprofits, whether it be DV or other, there's many different players out there, allies in every sector, that if we really want to end this thing, we're going to have to activate not just law enforcement. We spent the first couple of years here spending a lot of effort and time training law enforcement, getting them up to speed about this, getting them to care about the issue of demand, and we've done so much work there, and there's been thousands of arrests that have been made through the National Day of John's arrests and other efforts, and that's great, and we know that that's extremely important because buyers still have to have that credibility that they could get arrested, and we actually want to increase the perception of risk amongst all the stages so that buyers are a little bit more worried about getting caught. And they're a little bit more clear about what the consequences would be if they did get caught. So if you take our buyer journey wheel and you overlay this sector wheel, which is really the way that a lot of issues are being addressed today, Gail Bryant, who's one of my heroes in the anti-pornography space, she talks about a multi-systems, multi-sector approach to ending pornography use amongst young boys. And so what about if we do this multi-sector, multi-systems approach to ending sex buying? So this is what I believe is the beginning of a social movement. And it's born of people like you and me, all of us on the phone today, who are challenging a social norm. We feel that this is an unfair social norm where it's tolerated, although it's illegal in all 50 states, it's somewhat tolerated in a lot of circles. Sex buying is considered not that big of a deal. It's truly a social movement that we're having to do to make this social change. We know that social norms guidelines are really the expected behaviors, the should do's and the must do's, and things that are even taboo or built into our culture. So our challenge, our goal after all of us that are working on this issue is to make sex buying a should not do, a must not do, a could not do, a would not do for younger boys in a generation where those boys will be raised that they could not even imagine a world where women are bought and sold on Craigslist or Backpage, just like you would buy anything else as a commodity. So I'm very hopeful in the work I've been doing here on the ground in Arizona, especially with the younger generations of boys, that we're going to get to a tipping point between generations where there are going to be groups of boys, younger boys, that will be raised to a place where this is not tolerated and there's no way that they could be sexually pleased or gratified by exploitation of any kind. I may be a little Pollyanna in my thinking on this, but I have to be this way or else I couldn't get up every day and do the work that I do. I see progress and I see potential and I see real possibility for all of us working in this field, and I think this is how it all comes together. So the next slide here is, this is what's asked to us a lot when we were building out this buyer journey. Who's the target audience? Who do you want to share this information with? And of course, our first answer is we want to share it with everybody. We want to share it with the general public who's just learning about prostitution or just learning about sex trafficking. We want to take those people who, 5 years ago they would have learned about sex trafficking and they would have wanted to open a shelter. We want those same people, that same energy when they first learn about sex trafficking, to go all the way to demand and put all of their energy and effort into fighting demand as the actual final solution to this problem. We want to share the buyer journey with new cities and new groups that are interested in testing out demand reduction tactics. We in the CEAS Network have done so much work on this issue over the past several years, and we're really ready to share what we've learned. We're ready to share what works, what doesn't work, some tips and strategies of how to be more effective than maybe we were in some of the efforts that we tried. So we are putting together that playbook of that will be sort of a how-to guide, and it will all be based off of this buyer journey model. We'll literally be able to click on a certain area on the wheel, a certain stage, learn, discover, whatever the stage is, and then click through to the tactics and learn how to do them yourselves. Another target audience, obviously, would be the other sectors, the educators, policymakers, nonprofit leaders, faith leaders, healthcare providers, business leaders, media, tech industry, all those other groups. We want to let them know about this problem and let them know how they can get involved, where along the journey they can insert their efforts, their influence, their energy to helping us end this problem. Bianca, you want to go to the takeaways and then we can open it up to some questions?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's great, Angie. And I think some of the main takeaways we had just from doing this exercise of the buyer journey really is that we don't want to focus just on disrupting individual sex buyers. It's really not about that single journey that happens. Like we recognized earlier, all journeys may be different or are different, but really looking at those multi-sector systems approaches. What are the cultural influences? What are the public attitudes and social attitudes that reinforce sex buying? How do we really look at those root causes to end the demand? Like as Angie said, with the end goal of reducing victimization of people. I mean, that's really what we're all after here. It's not to go out and shame or talk about weaknesses. It's really, at the end of the day, we want to reduce victimization and commercial sexual exploitation of others. So it's looking beyond really the individual behaviors, but really looking at what are those systems approaches and those influencers that cause this behavior. And also reinforces the need to think upstream, like we were saying. Do we put our energy in those primary prevention efforts to end this problem in the long term, or are we going to continue to spend a lot of time and energy looking at just really those immediate disruption tactics, which of course it's a wheel, so it's all important, right? It's a cycle, and we need to look at all of it and continue all of it, but we also want to make sure that we're looking upstream and looking at some of those root causes of the issue. And really, it's just a framework. It's just as a starting point that we can use, and recognizing that there is not one single buyer journey, but there's different types of buyers, there's different types of services, there's different types of, and I say services in quotes, and really looking at those are all needing of different types of targeted messaging. And so but this can serve as really a framework in how to apply that in those different scenarios and those different transaction types or service types. Did you want to add anything to that, Angie?
Yeah, I just wanted to pause and congratulate all of us in the movement for really doing something that we didn't even realize we were doing this. We didn't even realize that we were addressing the issue very much like a Google or a Salesforce or another industry leader would address any sort of online transaction or online purchase product. So we just kind of came across all this organically. And so if we could leave you with anything, I hope that you would be inspired to continue this work. If you are law enforcement or you are someone in government, that you would be emboldened to continue to increase fines and penalties, that you would continue to do operations so that buyers are put on notice eventually, that they do not feel that they can continue to buy in a vacuum here where no one's looking or no one cares. And that for those of you who are in the nonprofit industry or perhaps the industry that looks at trafficking victims, maybe you can start thinking about how can you care about demand and why does this matter? How can you activate partners and funders and people that have proven that they're definitely bought into wanting to end the exploitation of vulnerable people in our communities? How can we activate them to get involved in demand? And if they're ready, then we in the CSNET Network believe that it is our duty to shepherd along new people, new allies, to get this work done so that we can see a time in our lifetime when we do see an end to it. I guess at this time, Zakir, we'd like to open it up if there's any questions.
Great. So let's start with this question. You talked about the engagement of other sectors in the work to combat demand. Can you talk a little bit about the role of community in this effort and what part community or families that are connected to buyers can really play in this work? Where are those opportunities?
Sure. So I'll give my 2 cents, and then Bianca, you can add yours.
Sure.
Communities are very important in this work. Several years ago, we have a street track here in Arizona. It's the 27th Avenue corridor, and there is a very committed group of people, of residents that care about the issue, that were just enraged about prostitution happening in their front yards and on their street corners and next to the businesses that they were operating. So that community came together. They demanded what the community has is a voice, and they have political power to influence the lawmakers that are responsible for their area. So for us in Phoenix, we have city council members that are responsible for certain parts of town. If the community rallies up against an issue, the city council member is going to listen and bring that issue forward to the city council and to the mayor, at which point the mayor would, probably go out to law enforcement and say, look, we have a problem in this area. Can you put more energy or more officers or more efforts or resources into this particular part of town? So for us, we need the community to say, we don't just want you to pick up all the prostituted people and arrest them and take them off to jail. We want you to do something about these guys who drive up and down the street with their windows down, or they pull up into the gas station or the fast food place, and they're making these solicitations out from their cars. We want you to care about them too. So that is one of the areas that the community can get involved. I personally believe that the single most important thing we can do as parents, and I have young people ages 14 to 22 in my household, we talk about porn all the time, caring about, how are young people being socialized to see violence against women. What are they learning? What turns them on? Why is this dangerous? How can that reset their appetite and their taste and head them on a way down a very ugly path? So I think the communities should really care, especially communities that interact with middle school age and high school age kids. I think they have a big role there. I also think the community can play a role in rehabilitation, offering a safe space for buyers who may feel like they have sex addiction or other mental health issues, to have groups or places to talk. Perhaps faith communities can have, anti-porn, breaking the habit of being, porn watching or various things that feed into. Bianca, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's starting with, your own families and friends and networks, social networks, and maybe shifting, obviously a lot of us get into this discussion through anti-sex trafficking conversations, so that's usually a starting point. But how do you extend that conversation then, to, like Angie said, to reach demand? And that can start with your own family. I have a 7-year-old son as well. How am I starting to see those early cues of inequality, gender inequality, and things like that? And how can I just question that in an age-appropriate way with him? Because that is the starting point. So starting within our own families, starting with those social networks. The CASE curriculum, for instance, in Chicago is great examples of males at the bachelor party, or males at a social setting where hiring a stripper or hiring a prostituted person is what they do, and someone standing up and being an upstander to say, no, that's not what I do, and having the courage to say that, because we do hear story after story about how just there's a group camaraderie mentality where they go for it because of that group and social cohesion around it, and that social acceptability. So standing up to those, and building our young people to be able to be upstanders to it. So I think starting with ourselves and our own communities and networks, and then going beyond that.
Thank you. We have a question from Jennifer Crawford. Is any training on this being rolled out to the public in some way via outreach, or being used by law enforcement in their trafficking presentations yet?
This is day one. You guys are at we are unveiling this brilliant concept that we're so proud of today. No, there's no training yet, but we are excited to go on a roadshow and get this thing out there to as many people as we possibly can, because we believe in it. We truly feel like this is just the light bulb went on, and we were like, this is it. This is the solution. This is how we end this thing. So yes, we are excited to roll it out. We want to make it very user-friendly. This webinar will be recorded, and so you can share it in your communities, or we're happy to do an additional one going forward, or on Insight trainings. Hopefully this stuff can be at other conferences that are non-sex trafficking related, those other sectors out there. I would love to see an education conference where there's a session on this there, or a faith conference where this is the issue that's taken. Bianca, anything?
Thank you.
Oh,
yeah, nope, that's great.
Well, thank you. Our time has now come to an end, but I want to thank our presenters again for the insightful information and education on buyers and their journey that you've presented today. It's been quite extraordinary to hear about all the insights garnered throughout the development of this incredible tool and incredibly insightful resource. To the active listeners on the line, thank you again for taking the time to join us. If you have any questions concerning the content from the presentation, please feel free to reach out to Angie or Bianca directly. Their contact information has been provided. And we hope that you'll continue to join us during our monthly webinar series and take advantage of the opportunity to continue to gain insights and access to education on advancements being made to combat commercial sexual exploitation in the U.S. Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye.